What's up, beautiful people? Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It doesn't matter what time it is. Just know today is the day that the Lord has made, and I will rejoice and be glad in it. Why? Because as always, God is good and He's good all the time. Duh. Y'all already seen. We get back into it. We got to finish this book, man. Okay. I messed up and I actually recorded chapter 12 already, but I accidentally deleted it. So I'm doing chapter 12 over. Okay. And y'all make sure that y'all look for chapter 13 because I'm actually going to start rolling through these because I'm trying to finish this so we could potentially move on to another book. Now, in the past, I have mentioned that I have bought a Thomas Sowell book. And a lot of contrarians to my claims have been saying you should read Thomas Sowell. Okay. And most of the time, I believe that they were pushing this because I'm black, and these were people who weren't black, and they love finding black people who shares their perspective. So then they use them as like this motherfucking, igniter that's supposed to get with other black people and say, hey, let me ignite the same motherfucking thoughts that I have into you so that way we can be a monolith, even though we constantly say we're not a monolith. Okay. So we try to move on to the next motherfucking book, and we can't move on if we don't finish this one. Blood at the Root, a racial cleansing in America, okay? So, without further ado, we about to get into it. Chapter 12, y'all. Let's get into it. So the first motherfucking chapter is called When They Were Slaves. Not long after the hanging, somewhere in Georgia, an amateur photographer lifted a negative out of its fixing bath, held it up to the light, and peered at the only known photograph taken on the day of the executions. The photographer had scrambled to high ground, unfolded the bellows of a camera, and taken a shot looking back over the jumble of buggies lined up on Tolbert Street. As thousands of people spilled out of Ansel Strickland's pasture and headed back towards Cumming. Two men in the foreground stared directly into the lens with an expression common to so many lynching photographs of the Jim Crow era. Somber, but self-assured. Earnest, yet openly content. But the most startling thing about the image is that in the bottom right corner, three young black men can be seen standing among the crowd. On a day when the overwhelming majority of Forsyth's African-American residents had already fled across the county line, these men were part of the small group of holdouts in Cumming, who still had hope they might weather the season of violence and hold on to whatever it was that had kept them in Forsyth, despite the obvious risks. So when a lot of people say, well, why did these people run out? They tried to, diminish the effects that racism and poor white people had on the expulsion of the working class black people. Many people say, well, why didn't they just stand and fight? Why didn't they stay? Well, you had a few who did. And I'm dang sure that they're about to explain what happens to the few who did, which we've already met in previous chapters. Some residents of Forsyth County who tried to stand their ground, get armed and everything, and still their property was burned. They were met with violence that basically resulted in them deciding to ensure my safety and my survival. I'm just going to leave this cause alone. So this whole idea of why don't you just fight, it's not always feasible, at least perceived at that moment by the people. So instead of outside looking in, trying to get an understanding of where people's mental was at, their mens rea, you might want to just get the context of the history around there and just try not to put yourself in those shoes, because honestly, you can't speak to an experience that you have never and may never experience. And even if you did experience it, right, your perceptions of it may differ than the next person. So it doesn't negate someone else's experience. But let's get back to it. One of the men sits in the driver's seat of a buggy, having unhitched his mule and allowed it to graze by the roadside. The other two are caught in conversation. The man on the left wears a rumpled hat, a white shirt, and a simple coat. But the other, in the center of the group, is dressed like a man of means, with his crisp bowler, long top coat and bow tie, and a gold watch chain looping down from the buttonhole of his vest. With his elegant attire and air of wealth, this figure bellies the stereotypical image of the 10,098 banished people of Forsyth. A great many of them were indeed poor, illiterate field hands and hired men like Rob Edwards, Ernest Knox, and Oscar Daniels. Still, there were others who had managed, through skill, patience, luck, and decades of hard work, to not only survive in post-emancipation Forsyth, but thrive there. These successful black residents, like the dapper gentleman in the photograph, were among the very last African Americans to leave the county, not because wealth and property were any protection from the mobs, but because they had more than anyone else to lose. Now, let me show you the pictures that they have. So you can't identify them completely, excuse me. But you see it says a crowd near the gallows where Knox and Daniel were hung, with Shawnee Mountain in the distance, October 25th, 1912. And this is what they mean by earnest look and somber and content. And then I'll show you the next picture that they got. These are somebody's family. 3 witnesses to the Knox and Daniel hanging, October 25th, 1912. The only 3 residing black men, African Americans, who stayed behind despite the risks of the explosion that was taking place. One such man was Joseph Kellogg, the largest black property owner in the county. When emancipation finally reached Georgia in 1865, Joseph's parents, Edmund and Hannah, had begun building a new life as free citizens of Forsyth. They were more fortunate than most former slaves, given that they had 8 adult children, including 6 strong young sons, and had been staked to a small parcel of land by their former owner, a white merchant named George Kellogg. Sound like the cereal man, who had moved to Georgia from Hartford, Connecticut. By 1870, only 5 years after the South surrender at Appomattox, the 62-year-old Edmund could report to the tax collector that his total estate was $125, an impressive sum for a man who had been enslaved for more than 60 years. 4 years later, he owned multiple lots near Suwannee Mountain, north of Cumming, totaling 8 acres with a reported value of $345. Edmund's eldest son, Joseph, had been the legal property of a white man when he was born. But he was just 23 when freed, and so the early years of Joseph's adulthood were marked not by the hopelessness of slavery, but by one new milestone after another. There was the day, July 2nd, 1867, when Joseph and his younger brother Louis stood in line at the Forsyth County Courthouse, shoulder to shoulder, with a white man who 2 years later might have bought and sold them like livestock. When they signed oaths of allegiance to the United States government, scratching small X's above their name, they became, for the first time in their lives, qualified voters. There was also the day, July 21st, 1868. Mind you, this is 1867 that they supposedly became qualified voters. There was also the day, July 21st, 1868, when they learned that Georgia had ratified the 14th Amendment, granting in theory, if seldom in practice, equal protection of the laws, regardless of color or previous conditions of slavery or involuntary servitude, which, according to the 13th Amendment, is currently now what we call corporal punishment, aka incarceration, which slavery is allowed as long as it's a form of corporal punishment. It's a punishment for the incarcerated. So technically, the 14th Amendment would, in theory, provide equal protections of the law, regardless of incarceration status, you see, because of this talking about previous conditions of slavery and involuntary servitude. I mean, that's what incarceration is. Them people ain't volunteer for that. But anyways, and then there was the day in 1870 when they celebrated news that the right of black men to vote had been enshrined in the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It would take more than a century of struggle to even begin to realize the promises that federal lawmakers made to the Kellogg's during these early years of Reconstruction. But as Edmund, Joseph, and the rest of the Kellogg's harvested one successful crop after another in the 1870s, and as they reinvested their earnings in acquiring more and better land in Forsyth, they had good reason to hope that going forward, the protection of law and government might actually be available to them. Looking out over their farm at the base of Suwannee Mountain, they surely believed that Forsyth would always be their home. Filled with that hope on a crisp fall morning in September of 1871, a 29-year-old Joseph Kellogg asked 18-year-old Eliza Thompson to be his wife. When she said yes, rather than jumping the broom, as blacks had done to consecrate marriages in the days of slavery, they walked together to Cumming, accompanied by a local minister named Silas Smith. As it happens, Reverend Smith was the father of Grant Smith, the man who would be horsewhipped on the same town square 4 decades later. So 40 years later, to these individuals get married, the son of Reverend Silas Smith, Grant Smith, who is also a reverend, is dragged and horsewhipped for vocalizing that the murder of Miss Alice Crowe was in fact inflicted by white men, not black men. Because he was vocal, they pretty much brutalized them, you know. But the explosions of 1912 were still far in the future on the day of Joseph and Eliza's wedding. And when Reverend Smith signed their marriage license and dated it September 7th, 1871, they must have had all great expectations for this new America in which black people had the right to receive fair wages for their labor, own land, vote, and even hold elected office. It's true that the majority of African Americans in Forsyth still worked on the same farms where they had been enslaved, and that, like black people all over the South, they were widely exploited and cheated by whites under the new contract labor system. But for the first time in their lives, people like Joseph and Eliza Kellogg had the right to protest the injustices whites committed against them, and at least the possibility of legal remedy. The face of the new law in Forsyth, which had always been the local sheriff, now included the county's own representative of the United States government, who had an office located right on the Cumming Square. Over its door hung a sign that read BRFAL. The acronym stood for the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. Now, it's interesting because currently in the day and age, here we are in 2025, it is not uncommon for black Americans to display views that are literally parallel, you know, they're aligned to the views of racist white people as it pertains to immigrants, foreigners, refugees, right? We hear the rhetoric surrounded mostly by ethnic foreigners because for the longest, WAPs, without papers, were referred to Italians, right? Mix was referred to Irish people. And the Quakers even dealt with negative dealings of the people who, came to the United States a little before them in the hopes of colonization. And every time a newer group of people come in, you got the people who just been here for a little bit, you know what I'm saying? But they not really, like rooted to this land. They just as much as foreigners as the people that they motherfucking exploiting and saying, hey, we don't really want them there, even though we want them here for free to, in cheap labor. But they set up all of these obstacles against them to ensure that they have no fighting chance in the court system, because as long as you have no fighting chance in the court system, you are not acknowledged as an individual worth receiving justice. So the time that is given to exploit you is prolonged. And this is why there's so much fight against immigration. It's not because people strongly believe that immigrants and refugees are causing crime and taking jobs and, they're lazy and they're coming here with, these malice ways. But in fact, our borders have been open to refugees and immigrants for the longest. But on paper, right, according to the 14th Amendment, we all have equal rights to the protections of the Constitution, which includes immigrants, refugees. See, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Land. Now, this more than likely was a group put together by Black individuals. You got freedmen and people who will expose people who were kicked out, chased out of their land, their counties, creating a bureau that is supposed to provide justice for people who have been abused as a refugee, abused as a former slave who is now a freed individual, those who once upon a time had access and control and possessed their land, and now they don't because they were chased out of there. This bureau was set into place to help individuals like this. But now in 2025, people have you to believe nobody gives a dang about refugees and foreigners, even though they've always been included, whether it's been constitutionally in our laws, whether they have protections, or it's inexplicitly stated, whether it's vaguely placed into state laws and local municipal laws. There's always been a protection to them. But view ignorance to the laws and ordinances that governs you, and then you continue to fall into the propaganda that these foreigners are harming you and taking from you, even though the people who are pushing these ideas to you are the ones who in fact are harming you, because they're taking jobs from you and they're giving it to a group of people that they are strategically trying to convince you that they are useless, they're worth nothing. So don't even bother fighting to make sure that they get equal pay, that they get equal access to services, that they get equal benefits to you. You're better than them. You're a citizen. They're foreign. Even though the law allots equal all the way around. Propaganda will convince you to believe otherwise. And in this day and age, it's not uncommon to hear Black people be anti-immigrants. Yet Black people in the late 1800s created, or the early 1900s, created what is known as the Bureau of Refugees, aka foreigners, freedmen, and abandoned lands, people who've been literally removed from land that they own. So let's get back to it. Abraham Lincoln had established the Freedmen's Bureau as part of the Department of War, intending it to operate for 1 year after the Confederate surrender, with the express mission of helping protect the rights of people like Joseph and Eliza Kellogg as they made the difficult transition from slavery to freedom. The bill Lincoln signed into law on March 3, 1865, just a month before his assassination, gave the Bureau power to rule on disputes between Blacks and whites in all places where local courts disregards the Negro's right to justice before the laws. In modern time, not just the Negroes, but we see Mexican immigrants, Haitians, other people that's from the Caribbean islands, the African folk. I mean, we got you know, white foreigners coming here, and it's not to downplay, because I know that ambiguous language tends to obfuscate, which means to intentionally, you know, distort your knowledge or your view on what's really going on. But the truth of the matter is that this isn't no new phenomenon. They just continue to recycle the same tactics. They just use the next group of people, you know, and then they use the previously, you know, oppressed people to support the oppression of the new group of people. But let's continue. Federal officials quickly recognized that Forsyth County, Georgia was just such a place. The Freedmen's Bureau office at Cumming opened in March 1867, headed by a man named Alexander Burris Knuckles. The 37-year-old Knuckles, a local Baptist minister, was typical of the first group of Freedmen's Bureau agents in Georgia, who were appointed by Brigadier General Davis Tilson. Tilson is best known as the man who reversed Sherman's Field Order 15, which had given freed slaves a share in the vast abandoned plantations along the Georgia coast. So Tilson reversed legislation that had given free slaves a share in plantations that have been abandoned along the Georgia coast. Having reneged on the promise of 40 acres and a mule, see, that goes again. Reneging on 40 acres and a mule. This is a repeating motif. Anyways, Tilson went on to appoint a whole class of Freedmen Bureau agents like Reverend Knuckles, who were ill-suited to the job of imposing federal law on resentful local whites. The U.S. has a history of appointing people into positions that are inadequate and incompetent in their positions. It's an intentional tactic, but we'll continue. These were local men with strong connections to former slaveholders in a deep personal investment in the status quo, maintain slavery. To make matters worse, under the original arrangements of the Freedmen Bureau, agents were not given government pay. They were compensated by the white landowners for whom they certified labor contracts. The system was abused all across the South, and when Tilson was replaced as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau in Georgia, his successor, Colonel Caleb Sibley, realized just how corrupt the Bureau had become and just how woefully it had failed to protect vulnerable African American communities. As Sibley put it, the power delegated to these resident white appointees were shamefully abused, and they occasionally inflicted cruel and unusual punishment, which violates, if I'm not mistaken, the Eighth Amendment. Sibley fired most of the original Bureau agents in 1867 and replaced them with Northern military men in the hope of establishing impartial legal tribunals that will give freed slaves their first taste of real justice. On April 1st, 1867, Knuckles was relieved of command of the Cumming Freedmen's Bureau office and replaced by Major William J. Bryan, who hailed from North Carolina and who owed his $1,200 annual salary and his allegiance not to local white property owners, but to the United States government. As a small cog, and a cog it's basically saying withholding pay. As a small cog in the great machine of the Bureau, Agent Bryan focused his efforts in Forsyth on disputes brought by black workers whose employers refused to honor verbal and sign labor agreements. Where do we know this to happen? Colonizers, Europeans, white folks, not abiding by the treaties that they established also with Native Americans. Interesting how they have this history of lying, deceit, and renege. But let's continue. Anyways, like former slave owners all over the South, the white planters of Forsyth were frequently ordered to appear before the Freedmen's Bureau court for withholding crop shares and payments to black field hands who, for the first time in the history of the state, had to be repaid a fair wage. Records of the cases heard by Major Bryan are peppered with the names of the same white men who featured most prominently in the list of Forsyth slave owners in the 1850s and 60s. Tolbert Strickland, scion of the Hardy Strickland family, which had owned more than 100 slaves in 1860, appeared before Bryan 6 times in a single week in October of 1867, charged by his employees with refusing to pay wages owed and refusing to give tenants a share of crops they had spent the entire year planting, tending, and harvesting. I wonder if this is the same Strickland family whose name is all over a bunch of products in Costco. Because we've come to the realization that a lot of modern day wealthy individuals, wealthy families, those that have established generational wealth, established that generational wealth off of the back of slavery in the United States as it pertains to what we're, the country we're residing. So it makes me wonder, is this the same Strickland whose name is all over a bunch of products inside of Costco, who continuously went before this bureau with complaints by his employees saying that he hasn't been paying them fair? That would explain the pervasiveness in Costco and the wealth that is still here. But let's continue. In case after case, Bryan found in favor of black plaintiffs. Most of his judgment ordered white employers to honor prior agreements, usually after black laborers produced documents detailing what they were owed according to contract. It is also clear that absent court orders, many whites would do everything possible to avoid paying. When one man, Newton Harrell, was sued by a black employee listed only as John, Harrell presented a document in which the man seemed to agree to work for nothing but room, board, and clothing. This is what a good portion of black individuals worked for off the strength of deception. But let's continue. Upon closer inspection, it became clear that Harrell had forged the agreement, and Bryan ruled that the contract was a fraud. On days when black workers did prevail in court, they frequently suffered for the victory after dark. When one group of white planters was forced to pay black workers, the Bureau's judgment was followed by a night of terrorism. The whites who lost the case, Bryan said, retaliated by breaking into the house of one man and shooting at the complainant in the night. Another black family was burnt out, all this in Forsyth County. Shot a man up, burned another family out because you lost in court for violating your written agreement, contractual agreements. Interesting. Bryan also had the power to review and reverse civil court judgments involving freed people, and many of these cases involved the practice of legally binding minor children to white masters. It's not much different than what we see now in the day and age of child trafficking, the stripping of parents, especially black parents, by CPS, Child Protective Services, and any foster system that's linked to them. Strange, but let's continue. Let's see what they say. So, Bryan had also had the power to review and reverse civil court judgments involving freed people, and many of the cases involved the practice of legally binding minor children to white masters. In theory, these agreements were a kind of social welfare. We get to somewhere. Meant to provide shelter, food, and clothing to black children orphaned and left destitute by the war. Sound like CPS, don't it? This might be the onset of CPS. Many former slave owners at Forsyth offered to take in such children as apprentices. So former slave owners take these children as apprentices and teach them a trade in exchange for years of labor. But in reality, here's the reality, the apprentice system was highly corrupt, and Bryan found in case after case that such contracts were a thinly veiled form of re-enslavement. With black children bound out to the white masters who had owned their families before emancipation and for whom they now worked for little or no pay. The youngest apprentice in Forsyth was John A. Armstrong, who was not yet 5 years old when he was bound to M. C. Chastain until the age of 21, from 4 to 21, 17 years. He was human trafficked, child trafficked to M.C. Chastain. Historian Eric Foner has written that all over the South, ideas inherited from slavery displayed remarkable resilience. During Reconstruction, noting that for those accustomed to the power of command, the normal give and take of employer and employee was difficult to accept. Such was undoubtedly the case among the former slave owners of Forsyth, as they fought to preserve the pre-emancipation social order even long after the war. In March of 1866, for example, Hardy Strickland went to the Freedmen's Bureau office in order to bind a 16-year-old named Thomas Strickland, a little black boy. After laying out the terms under which Thomas would continue to live in a slave cabin on the Strickland plantation, the document stipulated that Thomas had to faithfully obey Hardy Strickland's command and keep his master's counsel. It says Thomas binds himself to live with and continue to serve until he arrives at the age of 21 years, obeying the commands of the said H.W. Strickland, behaving himself faithfully. This seems like the early onset of them labeling black children as having behavioral problems, which ultimately is what fuels special ed amongst the school systems with black kids. Majority of the black children in the special ed program are not in there for learning disabilities. They're not in there for mental illnesses, but they're in there for behavioral problems, which a lot of the behavioral problems are talkative, being very active. Children like to play, but these actions are labeled disruptive, attention deficit hyper disorder, and all types of weird labels, just so they can further make a dollar and further oppress and hinder individuals. Early onset of that. That's what this looking like, but let's continue. So he wants him to behave himself faithfully, neither revealing his secrets nor at any time leaving or neglecting the business of said Strickland. He wants you to keep his dirty secrets, neither leave nor neglect the businesses of said Strickland, even though the profit that you help him acquire, you won't see not damn cent. Interesting. Most of the children bound out in this way were not orphans at all, but prisoners to their former enslavers. Still enslaved long after emancipation. A black mother named Jenny complained to the Freedmen's Bureau about John Hockenhull Sr. She complained about John Hockenhull Sr. I love to come back to these names because a lot of these names, their descendants are still alive and well. Especially if you live in Georgia, you better look up these names because these might be a lot of the wealthy individuals who are still established in their wealth based on your ancestors and their demise. But let's continue. So a black mother named Jenny complained to the Freedmen's Bureau about John Hockenhull Sr., the father of Dr. John Hockenhull Jr., who would dress May Crow's wounds and testify against Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel, two individuals who had nothing to do with this girl's murder. They just so happened to be black. Oscar Daniels was a foreigner in the sense of he was from out of town, visited family, and y'all know how people, you ain't from around here, it had to be you. After speaking with Jenny, Agent Brian wrote that Hockenhull now holds without consent her two sons and refused to let her have or see them. Charity Ramsey reported that her three children were being held by their former owner without consent and without compensation. Thomas Riley put it even more bluntly when he begged the Bureau for help retrieving his stolen child. Now, this is just three families: Jenny, Charity Ramsey, and Thomas Riley, begging for help about their stolen children. Mind you, this bureau was for refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands. But now this office is taking on another role, and that's helping retrieve stolen children, human trafficked children, for labor. After hearing and ruling on such cases for nearly a year, an exhausted and frustrated William Bryan appended a personal note to his monthly report for October 1867. At the bottom of a page filled with cases of white masters holding black children prisoner, of employers mistreating and defrauding black workers, and of vigilantes threatening to burn down a school for colored children, Bryan acknowledged the desperate situation of the freed people of Forsyth. It was a place where powerful whites rejected black citizenship on principle and resented the very idea of paying for black labor, which is still an issue today, where black people are not adequately compensated for their labor. I am fully satisfied from my observation, he wrote, that if the Freedmen's Bureau did not exist then, in my district, colored people would stand no chance of getting any more for their labor than when they were slaves. Interesting. He's saying without this bureau existing in his community, these people wouldn't receive any justice, any help, any restitution, any compensation, no, nothing. But let's continue. Bryan was alarmed not just at the hostile environment African Americans faced in Forsyth, but by what he saw as a downward spiral of violence, made all the worse by the Bureau's contraction in the face of opposition from Southern Democrats in Congress. A year later, he wrote another letter to Bureau officials, this time warning that, I'm going to read this line over, since we talked about Democrats in Congress, and it's very common to hear people say, well, Democrats were the ones that enslaved the people. And it's like modern day Republicans trying to separate themselves from Democrats of the past. And they overlook the fact that modern day Republicans were, back in those time, the Democrats of those time. The Republicans of their time then had more liberal views. They were more, we need to help the people. We need government oversight, ensuring that states and local municipalities take care of their people. These were the views of Republicans in the 1800s, right? They were literally called Democrats, Republicans. And then they dropped the name Democrat, and then they just been held on to Republicans. But you literally could Google the history of Democrat and Republicans, and you will find that modern day 2025 Republicans are equivalent to 1850s Whigs. Why? Conservatism. The Whigs at that time were the conservative party of that time, where the Republicans were more liberal, forward, progressive thinking. Democratic Republicans, liberal, which is what we see with current Democrats today, even though how they look on paper ain't really how they are in real life, but that's how they structured on paper, where modern day Republicans are the pastime Whigs. That conservatism followed them through and through. So you have people who think that, oh, the Republicans, we're not the ones that enslaved y'all. No, if you look in the history, it was a lot of those who, I won't say a lot, but there was quite a bit of those who identify as Democratic Republicans who were for the emancipation of slavery. They were the ones who fought in the Union. And the Confederates, right? The Confederates were fought by the Whigs, people with conservative views, people who were for slavery. It's like that guy that, I forget his first name, it's like General Lee or some trash. But a lot of people praise him for his action, his involvement in Americans' wars, you know, or is it Colonel Lee? I forget now, but it's like something Lee. We in the Marine Corps, we even have ditties about this man, where they glorify and lionize this turd, and whole time he was fighting to keep slavery going. Yet they got black people in the Marine Corps singing how great this man was. I would have still been enslaved if it was for him, but they got us singing ditties about him. I think the Colonel generally, I forget, but it's from the past, the 1800s. That nigga, y'all know who I'm talking about. But let's get back to it. A year later, he wrote another letter to Bureau officials, this time warning that affairs are in a worse condition than at any time in the last 20 months. There appear to be robbers, murderers, and a house of thieves at large in Cherokee and Forsyth counties, who are a terror to good citizens, both white and black. Complaints are frequent of persons refusing to divide crops with freedmen who have been working on joint accounts. I fear things are growing worse very fast. If Brian sounds anxious about what would happen in Forsyth if his office closed, he seems, in hindsight, to have been sadly prophetic. For these are among the last written records of the Freedmen's Bureau incoming. After that burst of activity between 1867 and 1868, when black laborers could use the power of the federal government to receive what was owed to them, and when distraught mothers could come to Major Brian for help rescuing their stolen children, in January of 1868, the coming Freedmen's Bureau office closed for good. January 1868, they started a year off closing the Freedmen's Bureau. They was like, this thing is giving us too much hassle, okay? You keep telling us that all these motherfucking employers are hindering and harming their employees. We just don't give a damn. They're black, okay? That month, Cummings saw the last of Major Bryan, who was a despised figure to many whites for having used his position exactly as Lincoln had intended it. Until the freedmen are protected by government officials, Bryan said in one of his last letters to superiors in Atlanta, until the freedmen are protected by government officials, Bryan said in one of his last letters to superiors in Atlanta, their freedom is only a name without its benefits. Bryan was reassigned to Marietta as the Bureau, underfunded and losing support in Washington, struggled to continue his work with fewer agents and fewer offices. This sounds a lot similar to what happens with a lot of institutions or establishments that are created in a way to help the people, give, oversight of the oppressors, but also provide transparency for the people. Here in Rochester, we have what is called PAB, the Police Accountability Board, right? And with the PAB has been under attack since its inception. And it went from when they created the PAB was supposed to have all this oversight and all this control, where when people file complaints, it would have some type of punitive or reprimanding power regarding the police officers that complaints were made against. But after, people in power, it didn't matter, Democrats and Republicans alike, but they literally took turns tearing up this police accountability board, combined with the president of the police union, Rochester's Police Union, which is called the Rochester Police Locals Club. This joker fought to the point where they dragged it in courts, and they basically stripped all powers, all powers from the Police Accountability Board, where they would hold these police officers accountable. Now they're simply reduced to just a reporting agency. So you can file your complaints to them, but now they're just this entity that receives complaints and then passes them on to whomever deals with the punitive measures of the police, which isn't the local police. It's actually the police union, Rochester's Locust Club. They have more power over our police than the police chief. And that is evident that they got more power, than city council and the mayor. They got more power than the police chief. You damn sure they got more power than the motherfucking city council and the mayor. The police chief answers to the mayor. And the mayor, every time, bumping heads with motherfucking the police accountability, or excuse me, with the Rochester's Locust Club president. Because at the end of the day, all them people paying their dues, money talks. And these people who are put into these positions to help us end up motherfucking closing their mouth and listening to the money, and then they walk with it. So there's no accountability, and it's crazy because this dismantling of a system that was created to help people, the very people that are being ostracized and oppressed and abused, right? It gets dismantled. That happens with every institution created to help people. But the institutions that are created to maintain its current status quo, you know, that one is going to stay in effect forever. But let's continue. In 1869, the Marietta office closed as well. And by 1872, the entire federal Freedmen's Bureau had ceased all operations as legal authority fell back into the hands of local sheriffs all over the South. Same thing with the Police Accountability Board. In 1906, the Gainesville News interviewed an old white man named George Harris Bell, who reminisced about his childhood in Forsyth in the 1870s and 1880s. Bell's recollections leaves little doubt that Major Bryan was right to have worried about what would happen to black residents once he was gone. As Bell strolled around Oscarville, he told a reporter about the Taylor Boys and how they had terrorized Forsyth just after the war. And in the 1870s, woe be unto the man who gained their enmity, for he was certain to be paid a visit. It was their favorite pastime to go at night to the home of someone they disliked and shoot into the house, throw rails and rocks into the well, blocking their water source, tear down fences and outbuildings, freeing their land, their land animals, tear down fences and outbuildings, cut open feather beds, and sometimes carry away guns, pistols, and other things they took a fancy to. Living as we did, only a short distance from their home, often have we seen them returning on Sunday morning, tired and worn out after making a raid on Saturday night. And these people will sit up in church and be over here rejoicing, singing old colonizer hymns unto the Lord after all that hell that they just wreaked on people. That's crazy. Be the very people that get to hear those words, "Get from me, I do not know you." Bell remembered the groups of white night riders expelling black people from the county long before 1912, such as the time a number of citizens whipped a Negro and treated him to a free ride upon a rail to the Chattahoochee River at Williams Ferry, set him across the river and told him never to be seen, and told him to never return. Against the odds and without legal protection, once the Bureau was disbanded, Joseph and Hannah Kellogg slowly built a prosperous life for themselves during those first decades of freedom. By the 1890s, nearly all of the advances of congressional Reconstruction had been reversed by the oppressive codes of Jim Crow. And yet, the Kellogg's were busy heeding the advice of Booker T. Washington and his Tuskegee Institute gave to Southern blacks at the end of the 19th century. Intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois viewed the South as a wasteland for black people and saw the industrial North as the only hope of safety and equal treatment under the law. That's a lie. But in his famous Atlanta Compromise speech of 1895, Washington declared that the corn rows and tobacco fields of the South would always be home to African Americans. It's crazy how braids that are braided back are referred to as corn rows, the same corn rows that our ancestors were working in its fields. But then you got people trying to claim corn rows as their motherfucking culture. I digress though. Let's continue. All right. Declared the corn rows and tobacco fields of the South would always be home to African Americans. 1/3 of the population of the South is of the Negro race, Washington said, and to those who underestimate the importance of perseverating friendly relations with a Southern white man who is their next door neighbor, I would say cast down your bucket. Where you are, cast it down. Make it friends in every manly way of the people of all races by whom you are surrounded. All right, Mr. Booker T. I'm about to call him Dubois. The road to betterment, Washington argued, was paved with hard work, savings, and thrift. And African-American farmers, laborers, and tradesmen would be truly safe only when they become highly productive members of the community, deeply interconnected with white prosperity. Washington might as well have been describing Forsyth's Black Kellogg family when he wrote that. The Negro should make himself, through skill, intelligence, and character, of such undeniable value to the community in which he lives that the community could not dispense with his presence. In proportion as the Negro learns to produce what other people want and must have, in the same proportion will he be respected. Joseph Kellogg had inherited the family land when his father Edmund died in 1874. He was exactly the kind of tireless and productive black farmer Booker T. Washington idealized. Joseph improved the family property such that, including machinery, buildings, and livestock, it had a total value of close to $600 in 1880. Record shows that by 1890, Joseph had purchased an additional 50 acres, and by the 1900 census, the Kellogg's were themselves landlords, renting to other black families and using the proceeds to accumulate more and more land each year. So when in April of 1910, census taker Ed Johnson walked north out of Cumming, he found the white-bearded 68-year-old Joseph Kellogg, who had been born into slavery in 1842, presiding over a 200-acre farm. Such a spread, stretching out over rolling hills in the shadow of Sawney Mountain, was the envy of people all over the county, especially the poor and propertyless white men who sometimes stopped and admired it from the road, shaking their heads and narrowing their eyes at the luck of old Joe Kellogg. Don't need no hateration, holleration. It's crazy. Haters will be a hater. But I get it. When you are constantly told that this group of people whom you rarely had any access to came in, took over access to services, products, access to jobs and such, and are the reason why you are currently living in despair and squalor, excuse me. And so you start to literally internalize these negative, views, and you literally start to basically molest and titillate this idea that these group of people whom you don't know, who are also being oppressed, equivalent to you, who don't have access to just about anything, equivalent to you, you're convinced that they've taken everything from you. And now you despise them. You hate them for it because you're coveting. And that's one thing I love to remind people. The Bible tells us, especially these good old self-proclaiming Christians, the Bible tells us, it speaks against coveting after our neighbors. A lot of your disdain and distrust, your poor views towards people, a lot of it is rooted in your own jealousy, your own envy, and covetousness of someone else's belongings. And when you learn to do like the Bible says, not covet after people, rejoice when you see someone else is blessed, your life will fare a lot better. But the truth of the matter is that divide and conquer tactics has been utilized in galore within the United States and its people since the inception, of the United States, as it was created as colonial America with 13 colonies. And then, even then, I think something is strange with the fact that colonial America was literally constructed out of solely 13 colonies. Why just 13? You know, but divide and conquer tactics has always been utilized to maintain status quo, you know. And at the end of the day, when we fall into, you know, the guiles of the enemy, and we fall into, you know, the distortions of our mind, and we start to believe that these lies that we have been programmed, you know, we've been programmed to believe that they're true, we start hurting ourselves, because at the end of the day, we're not even challenging the information that we're being presented. Like, we fail to realize that a lot of, you know, negative perceptions as it pertains to citizens, people that make up the United States population, a lot of our views towards our fellow brothers and sisters, our neighbors, comes from media. It comes from the people who've been put into these positions of power by God, but also by their own, you know, illegitimate means. And we fail to realize that these people can only thrive if they maintain their position. You can't maintain your position letting everybody into your space. And so this is why they strategically ostracize us, and they keep us at each other's throats, because then we'll be too blind to come together. I mean, we see it on jobs, where jobs encourage you to not talk to one another, because they don't want you to link up with someone else and say, hey, this is something that I've been dealing with. Have you been dealing with something similar to this? And then now you bouncing ideas off each other, you brainstorming, and then you starting to see like, oh, I ain't the only one that's been dealing with this. Or this ain't fair. This person got this and I ain't get this. Now you're able to do some compare and contrast, and you could get an idea of where the freak you stand in the world. But when strategic means are disseminated, which is keeping you from other people, keeping you ignorant, preventing you from interacting and talking to other people and getting an idea of what the freak is going on in the world, then these situations that we find ourselves in now, like oppression, the inability to grow, it's strengthened. It's strengthened. And so I just want to sit here and end this with saying that try not to internalize the ills that we've been subjected to, no matter who you are. Because at the end of the day, white, black, Latino, you know, Asian, Native American, we've all have dealt with similar, you know, oppressive tactics by the people that have been put in place to govern us, you know, and that has authority over us. And at the end of the day, they have made it their business to keep us fighting one another, so that way we don't come to the realization that I'm going through the same things that you're going through, despite you looking a little different than me. Bigotry is literally a tactic that is pushed by people in power to maintain their positions of power. So you don't realize that there's more of us than there are of them, right? Most people are anti, or at least I would like to think a lot of people who are poor are anti-oligarchy. But the oligarchs maintain their position of oligarchy by making you think that you are helpless. You can't do anything about your situation. You shouldn't talk to these other people because they're different from you and they want to take everything you have. And if you interact with them, they're going to kill you and take over all of everything you have. And then they induce you with fear, you know, of the other. And now you're fighting amongst one another because of ignorance. You don't know these people from a can of paint. And now Satan is having the time of his life on the playgrounds of your mind, just pushing all types of lies, and they're distorting your views of your brothers and sisters, your neighbors, and keeps you fighting and quarreling with them. All the while, we doing the jobs of the people who've been put into these positions to govern us, and we're maintaining their positions of power. It's the same as I've spoken in regards to taking pleas, right? I constantly tell people, you have the right to face your accuser. You have the right to trial. You know, the burden falls on the prosecutor to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you did what you are accused of. And you shouldn't waive those rights and make their job easier by just giving in to their bullying tactics and just rolling over and say, okay, I'll let you do whatever you want to do to me. Just speed this process up. Because that actually contradicts the Bible. The Bible tells us that don't be concerned about what man can call themselves doing to you on this earth. Because, yeah, they could destroy your body, but they can't do squat to your soul. This body is nothing. A lot of us that fear, life after this natural life, it's because you don't know Jesus. If you get to know Jesus, you won't be so scary. Because once you get to know Jesus, you realize he ain't give you a spirit of fear. That's why these people trying to pump you up with it. Jesus didn't give it to you. So they want to contradict Jesus by giving you something that Jesus didn't give you, because they know if they give you something that Jesus didn't give you, it'll distort your mind, it'll distort your vision, and it'll get you to turn from God. So I just want to end this with, yeah, I've had some negative dealings with colonizers, with white people, European descendants. But at the same time, I've had cordial dealings with them. And although the negative dealings seem more pervasive than the cordial ones, I will be indignantly lying to you if I say that they're all the same and I hate them equally. I don't hate them equally, and I don't think they're all the same. Yes, we all are flawed. Like the Bible says, ain't none good but the Father. So I'm not about to sit here and lie and say there's some good people out there. There's some good white people. Because that contradicts the Bible. Ain't none good out here. Not even us. Or not even me. So, but I'm not going to sit here and demonize a whole group of people because of some funky dealings that I have encountered and that my ancestors have encountered, when it was intentionally facilitated by means that we have no way of seeing with our carnal natural eyes, right? For the Bible says, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, rulers of darkness, powers in high places that is just unclean. And so once you realize who you are, what your purpose is, and you get the understanding that our ignorances and our differences are being utilized to cause tension between us and other people, then I think it starts to open the door for us to see, like, okay, maybe I shouldn't behave in the way that many people intend for me to behave, because of the fact that I've been awakened to the fact that I know that this is all a facade. This is a strategy for some to maintain their positions of power while they maintain the positions of inferiority for others. And when you realize that we are collectively in the same boat, or in this instance, a lot of people like to use the analogy crab in a bucket. We all are a bunch of crabs in the same bucket, despite what you look like. We're just a bunch of crabs in a bucket, trying to get up out of that motherfucking bucket. And it's hard as heck because of the parameters of that bucket. Whomever put us in that bucket, baby, they made sure that it would be hard as hell to get out. Not just for this group of people, not just for this group of people over here, but for every last one of us collectively. So I hope y'all learned something from this video. I don't want to keep y'all any more longer than I have babbling, but I thank y'all for stopping in here, chilling with me, vibing with me, and reading this book. And we're going to finish this book, and then we're going to move on. I don't know where we're going to move on to. I do need to get that Thomas Sowell book going since I already said I would. But I thank y'all for coming in here. Make sure you comment, like, share. Share this around so people can see it. And subscribe, okay? Because it helps me. It helps me, and it's minimal effort, but if that's a little too much for you, it's okay. For those who don't mind putting that little minimal effort and help a sister out, give me a like, comment, share, and a subscribe, and you'll help me out on the algorithm. So I thank y'all. God bless. And remember, watch as well as pray, man. I love y'all. Peace.